Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research and the To and Through Project, I want to welcome you to our research webinar, Navigating the Maze, Understanding CPS Graduates Paths Through College. I'm Jenny Nagaoka. I'm the Deputy Director at the Consortium and a Senior Advisor to the To and Through Project. So we're here today because we're extremely excited to be having the release of a report, which is the culmination of a few years' work. The report is available on the To and Through website, and we also have a couple other things that accompany the report. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on the report. First, Jasmine Lee, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later in this webinar, as well as Alexandra Usher and Alex Seaskin. So one of the things I'm really excited about with this report too is that May Malone has done a lot of work to produce ways of making the research finding in this report really accessible. So we're releasing a couple of research summaries that highlight some of the key findings from the report. One is geared toward practitioners and the other is geared towards students and their families. Another really exciting piece is the college pathway tool, which May will be walking us through later on in this webinar. That tool really provides a way for you to kind of go through and really think about the college pathways and see what those look like for CPS graduates. So we'll be sort of showing you some of the high-level pieces, and that's also what's in the report. But if you really want to dig a lot deeper into the numbers, the tool will really provide you a great opportunity to be able to do that. Another piece that I'm extremely excited about is that today we're doing the research webinar where we're highlighting the findings, but tomorrow we're having a panel of CPS graduates who will be talking about their perspectives and their experiences as they're trying to navigate the maze of college. And so this is a great opportunity because, in this report, we quantitatively show you what these pathways look like. But, I think really where we really start to learn what the experiences are, and in some ways where the research can become more actionable, is when we actually start to hear from students and understand what those pathways look like for them. Okay, so to highlight a bit of our agenda, so I'll be taking you through some of the research findings, and I'll be handing it off to Jasmine, who will talk about some more of the findings, as well as some of the implications of the findings from our work. May will walk us through a tool demo, and then there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. But I do encourage you that throughout this presentation, as you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A box. We'll be trying to answer some of them throughout the presentation, but we do have this time for the types of questions that require a little bit more of explanation that can be done through the chat function. So kind of to talk a little bit about why we started doing this research. So this is something that the consortium and the To and Through project have been highlighting a great deal, is that there's some really positive news coming out of the district. We're seeing more and more students graduating from high school. We're seeing more and more students enrolling in two-year colleges and four-year colleges. And we've also seen a modest increase in the number of students who are completing college. So there's some positive news there. But another piece that we also want to think about as we look at these rates is how this actually changes the number of students who are experiencing college and the number of students who are graduating. So on this figure, you can see how things have changed in terms of the number of students who are enrolling college between 2005 and 2018. So we're seeing increasing numbers of students. So we've actually seen more than a doubling of students who are going on to college. But if you start to look at earlier graduating classes, you do see where more and more students are completing bachelor's degrees, associate degrees, and certificates over time. But the other thing that is increasing at the same time are the number of students who are making an immediate transition to college, but who do not have a college credential within 6 years. And so thinking about this and thinking about what this actually means both for the students themselves, what this means for the district, what it means for higher ed, and the city as a whole. It really made us want to think a lot more about what's happening in between these two time points. A lot of the work that we've been doing focuses on kind of the beginning point of college enrollment. We're looking at when they graduate, but with this study, we're really trying to understand the patterns of what's happening in between college enrollment and college completion or non-completion. One of the things that we do want to acknowledge is that, we're looking at this from a quantitative perspective. So, we're seeing when students are in college and we know when they're not. And when students are not in college, there are probably a lot of different things that are happening there. It's not like students just disappear. There's a lot doing it. And that's part of why we're bringing in the student panel, and it's really, so if you show up tomorrow, it's really an opportunity to understand, both what's happening when students leave college, and then when they do leave, what does that look like? And so before moving into the findings, I wanted to touch on some key terms that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation. First, you probably kind of know what a CPS graduate is, but in this context, we are talking about students who graduated from the Chicago Public Schools between 2010 and 2012. And so these are our students who graduated, quite a while ago, but we're looking at earlier cohorts because we're allowing time for students to start college and then have 6 years to complete or not complete. The other thing to kind of note when we're looking at a time point that is long ago is that a lot has changed for both in CPS and in higher education between now being in 2021 and 10 years ago when these students were graduating from high school. College enrollment rates have been going up. Higher ed has become a lot more responsive to the needs of first-generation college students. There are a lot more supports that are available. So there's some ways where we hope that the patterns that we'll be showing you today will look different. But I think this is a really important starting point for us to be engaging and thinking about what are the patterns between college enrollment and college completion. So getting back to the terms, starting out with stopping out. So we're using the term stopping out to refer to when a student who was enrolled in college takes some time off, so they're not enrolled for at least one semester. Sometimes this means they're taking a formal leave of absence. There's a lot of other things that kind of happen when students stop being enrolled in college. The thing to note about this is we refer to it as a stop out, not a dropout. Because quite often, in fact, this is the most common pattern, is that when students stop out, they do return to college at some point. We're looking at a 6-year time period, and even during that time period, a lot of students are returning to college. We'll also be talking about continuous enrollment, which means that kind of as it sounds, students are continuously enrolled in college without taking a term off. We'll also be talking about direct transfers, which is students when they're transferring without stopping out between a 2-year college and a 4-year college, or between a 4-year college or a 2-year college. We're not looking at lateral transfers. So when a student is transferring from one 4-year college to another 4-year college, or one 2-year college to another 2-year college, while those are definitely something that is happening among CPS graduates. Because other research has shown that those types of lateral transfers don't have as big of an impact as a student's likelihood of completion, we did not focus on that in this particular study. One other thing I want to note here too is that when we're talking about these direct transfers, is that we are only looking at fall terms and spring terms. We're not including summer terms because there is a fairly common pattern where students who, for example, are enrolled in a four-year college take a course at a tier college in the summer and then go back to their original four-year college. Because those quite often the summer enrollments are sort of a temporary enrollment, we are not including them in the numbers that we'll be showing you today. Okay, so moving to the more interesting part of talking about our key findings. So the first thing I think is really important to talk about is the fact that CPS students who graduated between 2010 and 2012 are enrolling in college at really high rates. So we're looking at a 6-year time window, and during that time, 46% of students are enrolling in a four-year college within 6 years. 47% are enrolling in a two-year college, and 18% of them enrolled in a two-year college or a four-year college, and sometimes simultaneously at some point within those within that time period. So we're seeing really high rates in these earlier cohorts of enrolling. Although we do see about a quarter of students who do not enroll in college at all within 6 years of graduating from high school. One thing I do want to note is that, right now with the rising graduation rates, with rising college enrollment rates, these numbers would look really different for more recent CPS graduates. At the time, 63%, right now, 63% of CPS graduates are enrolling and making an immediate transition to a two-year or four-year college. At the time of the students in this study, that number was 7 to 9 percentage points lower. So we're seeing a really different pattern there. Another thing that I want to talk about, which is something that the 2-2 project had highlighted in an earlier report, is how much movement there is between two-year colleges and four-year colleges and four-year colleges and two-year colleges. I think a lot of times when we think about students moving across sectors, we think a lot about the transfer function of two-year colleges. And so moving from a two-year college, when you start a two-year college, you want a four-year college degree, so you're planning to transfer. And we do see that 22% of students who started at a two-year college immediately after high school do enroll in a four-year college within 6 years of graduating from high school. I think the thing with that previous report that was surprising, and we're continuing to see this pattern in this study, is how common the reverse pattern is. So that when we look at students who started at a four-year college, 29% of them are enrolled in a two-year college at some point within that 6-year time window after they graduated from high school. So the reverse is actually, like, when we think about 2 to 4-year college, but the reverse is also a really common phenomenon. Another aspect of transitions we wanted to highlight was stopping out, so taking at least one term off. Stopping out is tremendously common among students who start off at a two-year college. So of students who make an immediate transition to a two-year college, 83% of them, so like that's the vast majority of students, are taking at least one term off. And it's also extremely common among students who start off at a four-year college. So among immediate enrollees at four-year colleges, over half of them are taking at least one term off. And the reasons why this is happening are really, are very complicated. It's not something that we specifically look at in the study, but other research has shown how, for some students, it's financial barriers, there can be personal reasons, family situations, academic struggles, or a combination of all these different things. There's a lot of things that are driving it, but this is a place where I think, we always push for further research, and I think knowing more here is tremendously important. I think the other thing, too, is that as common as stopping out is, a lot of students do return to college. 1/3 of students who stop out return to college after one term. And then if we look at a little bit farther out, almost another third are returning after 2 or more terms. So I think what this tends to imply is that, you know, while leaving college is common, this is not because students do not want to return. And I would imagine that there are students who do not make a return to college in that time, in our 6-year time window, actually want to return, but are facing other challenges that are preventing them from doing so. So I think it's going to be important to kind of note that this phenomenon of stopping out is really different than dropping out or students deciding that college is not what they want to do, that they do not have the goal of completing a credential. It's something that seems to be really different for the vast majority of students who are taking at least one term off. The other thing to note, though, is that, you know, stopping out is really common. Students do try to return to college, but it's important to see that there are real consequences to this. So students who stop out are a lot less likely to complete. So if we look at the students who returned after stopping out for one term, and look at their outcomes after 6 years, 75% of them don't have a degree. Only 10% have a bachelor's degree, another 15% have an associate's degree. So it's really only 1/4 of those students who took one term off that complete a credential within 6 years. And the numbers are even lower when students are returning after 2 years or returning after 3 years. So while stopping out is really common, we also see where those students are also less likely to complete a credential. And those two things are very likely. The reasons why they are stopping out and the reasons why they are not completing are very likely very much associated, as opposed to being this a causal relationship. So just for like kind of like, I'm going to be handing it over to Jasmine in a minute, who will complicate these student pathways considerably. I've provided you sort of a high-level view of, you know, how students are intersecting with both tier colleges and four-year colleges. There's a lot of movement between those two. A lot of students are also stopping out. And then also a lot of them do return to college. So that's sort of like the high-level piece of this. But Jasmine will provide us a more nuanced picture about what these patterns look like. And from here, I will turn it over to Jasmine.
Thanks so much, Jenny. As Jenny had presented earlier, students are transitioning a lot, either stopping out, re-enrolling, transferring. It's not uncommon for CPS graduates. As we were looking at students' post-secondary movement, it became clear that these transitions weren't happening in isolation either. So for example, a student might start at a 4-year institution, transfer to a 2-year college, and then stop out, or a student might start at a 2-year institution, stop out, and then re-enroll a couple of terms later. This made it really difficult to understand the impact of any one transition on students' post-secondary trajectories and degree outcomes. As such, we decided to take a bird's eye view and look at students' sequence of transitions over time, in addition to focusing in on particular transitions. So in taking this approach, we found that students take many different pathways in post-secondary education. For the purpose of this report, we're defining a pathway as a semester by semester combination of enrollment and non-enrollment in a 2-year or 4-year college within 6 years of high school graduation. So each year consists of 2 terms, one for the fall and one for the spring, for a total of 12 terms, where students could be enrolled in a 4-year, a 2-year, or not enrolled for that term. Among the 63,000 students in the 2010 to 2012 cohorts of CPS graduates, students took more than 6,000 distinct post-secondary pathways. This wide variation of different pathways suggests that students are engaging in post-secondary education in a variety of ways, and that, once again, transitions in higher ed are quite common. In order to make sense of all of these different pathways, we decided to group students who had similar pathways together into 10 groups, as we'll show in the next slide. So we first grouped students based on where they were in the fall after high school graduation. Were you immediately enrolled in a 4-year institution, immediately enrolled in a 2-year institution, or did you not immediately enroll? We then broke down these 3 fall enrollment statuses even further based on students' first transition within 2 years of high school graduation, giving us that total of 10 path categories. So for students who immediately enrolled, their path categories were persisted in the same type of institution, made a direct transfer to a different type of institution, so no stopping out, no taking time off in between, or just having stopped out. For students who did not immediately enroll, the path categories were enrolled in a 4-year or a 2-year within 2 years, enrolled after 2 years, or remained unenrolled for the course of 6 years. We also track students based on whether they made a second transition before looking at whether they completed a degree within 6 years of high school graduation. If we were to look at all of this data in a table, it'd be a bit of an information overload, so we decided to visualize it instead. So for these next few slides, I'll be walking through a visualization that we're calling a path map for students who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college. We also have 2 more path maps, one for students who immediately enrolled in a 2-year college and one for students who did not enroll, which May will talk about later on in the presentation. For now, I wanted to walk through this path map for immediate 4-year enrollees first. So on the far left, we see the share of students within our cohort who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college. So we see around 36% of the graduating class of 2010 to 2011 immediately enrolled in 4-year college. When we look at this first transition period, that's where we see the different path categories that I had talked about in the previous slide. So we have the persisted in a 4-year college, transferred to a 2-year college, and stopped out. From this section, we can see that most students who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college also persisted in a 4-year college for 2 years, but we also see around 3,000 students made a direct transfer to a 2-year institution, whereas around 5,500 students stopped out as their first transition within 2 years. We then wanted to go a step further to know what students' next transition was after the one that had placed them in their initial path category in this next transition period. So here we see that, again, like the colors show what path category students are in. The thickness of the line or the width of the line shows the share of students who followed that path, whereas the position of the line show us whether and where students were by their next transition. So looking at this figure, we see most students who had been in the persisted in a 4-year college path category remain continuously enrolled in a 4-year institution. But we also see that some students transition to a 2-year college after 2 years, and a lot of students actually stopped out after 2 years as well. For students who had transferred to a 2-year college as their first transition, we see that some students do return to a 4-year college, but actually most of those students stop out as their next immediate transition. For the students who had stopped out as their first transition, we see most students are re-enrolling in college, predominantly in 2-year colleges. Now, for the last leg of the figure, we show students' degree or credential outcomes 6 years after high school graduation, based on what their path category was, as we can see from the color, as well as where they were by their next transition period, as we can see by the position of the lines. So from the full diagram, we see that most students who completed a 4-year degree were students who had persisted in a 4-year college for 2 years and remained continuously enrolled up until completion. However, when looking at the students who did not complete a degree or credential, we also see that students from many different path categories and many different pathways are also part of this group. So many of the findings we'll be sharing in this next section are based on what we saw in these different figures, these different path maps. As I mentioned before, May will present on the tool we created based on these visualizations so folks can explore and dig into the complexities of students' pathways themselves in their own time. So now I want to transition to talking about some common myths we found about college pathways based on our analysis of individual transitions, as well as the sequential pathways that I talked about earlier. So the first myth that we found was that of the direct path. The direct path being students continuously enrolled in one institution until completion. We found that for many CPS graduates, transitioning or having some form of transition over the course of 6 years, whether that be from going from enrolled to not enrolled or transferring to a different type of institution, was not uncommon. So this idea of the traditional path of staying in one place until completing most likely a bachelor's degree is actually not quite common for CPS graduates. The second myth we wanted to highlight is that of the 2 to 4 year college transfer. So among the 2011 CPS graduates who immediately enrolled in a 2-year college, 77% reported that they wanted to complete a bachelor's degree or higher. which means that even though students were immediately enrolling in a 2-year institution, many were coming in with the intention of completing a 4-year degree. A common piece of advice that students receive is to start at a 2-year college and finish gen ed requirements or prerequisite courses, and then transfer to a 4-year college as a way of saving money. We found that though this pathway isn't impossible, it's also very difficult. Around 1 in 5 immediate 2-year enrollees transferred to a 2-year college within 6 years, and around 7% of immediate 2-year enrollees completed a 4-year degree within 6 years. What we see from the data is that historically, the transition from a 2-year college to a 4-year college has not been very smooth, given how many students, or rather how few students, have been able to take this path in the past. That being said, students who do eventually transfer to a 4-year college have similar completion rates to students who immediately enrolled in a 4-year institution. But again, not many students are able to make that transition to a 4-year college in the first place. This has implications for both guidance counselors and how they advise their students, as well as higher education institutions in creating transfer articulation agreements between community colleges and 4-year institutions. Even in the time that's passed since these cohorts of students have graduated from high school, a lot has changed in the post-secondary landscape, especially in Chicago. And we're hoping to see these numbers go up over time to reflect some of those changes. So the third myth I wanted to highlight is this idea of taking time off school. Sometimes taking time off is seen as not being a big deal or being inconsequential. Our findings suggest, though, that taking a leave is both common and consequential. Many students who stopped out re-enrolled, which suggests that students are not leaving with the intention of completely disengaging from college. However, most of those students also did not complete a post-secondary credential within 6 years, despite having overcome barriers to re-enrollment. We also want to be clear that we're not trying to make a causal statement between stopping out and students' degree outcomes. If anything, stopping out is likely a symptom of a larger issue or barrier that students are facing, and we encourage folks to interrogate the root causes underlying stopping out within their own context and with their own students. The last myth that we want to highlight is taking a gap year. So what we found is that 9 out of 10 students who do not immediately enroll in college did not complete a college credential after 6 years. While some students who did not immediately enroll may not have intended to get a college credential, they could be taking time, they could have started working, they could have gone to military service, etc. There are a lot of different pathways students could take other than college. A lot of students who did graduate, a lot of our graduates did indicate that they did want to complete a post-secondary credential of some kind. There's a lot of advice given to students based on who college students were 20 to 25 years ago. However, who's going to college now is changing. We're seeing more students of color enrolling in college. We're seeing more low income and first generation students, as well as students who are working as they're completing their coursework. The beliefs and advice we had that assume students come from a certain kind of background, specifically upper middle class or white backgrounds, may be harmful given who college students are now. As such, we need to update the public discourse in how students are navigating the post-secondary landscape, which has implications for college counselors in terms of the kind of guidance they're giving students, as well as higher education in terms of how they're supporting and orienting students who are starting late or who are following paths that don't follow the traditional path of staying continuously enrolled until the completion of a bachelor's degree. So those are the 4 myths that we wanted to highlight today. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that what's been conspicuously absent throughout this webinar so far is race and gender. While these 4 myths are based on overall trends, how these myths manifest and the different pathways students take differ for different student groups, which adds more complexity to an already complex process. We could have a whole other webinar designated just for what post-secondary patterns look like when disaggregated by race or gender. And we know that this is an important conversation. That's why we created a tool that shows these disaggregations by race or gender so that people can explore for themselves the differences in immediate college enrollment and subsequent patterns of transferring and stopping out. We hope that this tool, which May is going to talk about in this next section, to be a resource for having more nuanced conversations about students' enrollment patterns and experiences through college. So with that, I'd now like to pass it to May to walk us through the College Pathways tool.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, so we created the To and Through College Pathways tool to enable users to explore in more detail the pathways that different groups of CPS graduates took through college. So the tool visualizes the post-secondary transitions that students made between the fall after high school graduation and 6 years later, and it enables users to look at pathways and outcomes for students based on their race/ethnicity or their gender. So today I'm going to demonstrate the general functionalities of the tool to give you a better sense of how you can answer some of the questions that our research presentation may have left you with today. And just to note, my colleague Dom will drop the link to the tool in the chat closer to the end of the webinar so that you all can explore for yourselves. All right, so first let's dive into how this web page is organized. There are 3 options in the top menu bar, the first 2 being fall enrollment status and degree outcomes. And these 2 options enable you to choose how you want to group students. So if you're more interested in looking at outcomes for a particular group of students based on where they were the fall after high school graduation, you would choose fall enrollment status. But if you're more interested in looking at data in the reverse, that is by grouping students based on their degree outcome and then looking back to see where they were the fall semester immediately following high school graduation, you choose that degree outcomes option in the top menu bar. At the very bottom of the web page, we have our research and definitions, which will give you a glossary of the various terms that we're using in these visualizations in case a phrase is ever unclear to you. So in this walkthrough, I'm going to start off with demonstrating the general functionality of the college pathways by fall enrollment status. And the default visualization is an interactive version of the pathways that Jasmine had walked you through earlier that were taken by immediate 4-year enrollees. And so we have multiple filters that you can choose for these visualizations, the first one being for which fall enrollment status group you would like to look at. And you can also choose which gender or race/ethnicity group you want to focus in on. Right now, we're just going to focus on all immediate 2-year enrollees in our sample. So to start, you might want to get a sense of the general proportion of CPS graduates in our sample who are actually captured by this visualization. To do that, you're going to hover over the leftmost bar in this visualization in order to get a sense of the percentage of students that are captured here, as well as the number. So 20% of high school graduates in our sample immediately enrolled in a 2-year college, and about 12,500 students are actually represented in this bar and in this overall visualization here. If you hover over the rightmost bars, you will get a similar pop-up box with information about the percentage of the immediate 2-year enrollees in our sample who completed a 4-year degree, for example. And the number below will tell you how many students are actually represented by this completed 4-year degree bar in the right. So the bars in the middle of the visualization actually represent transition points. The bars in the first transition column represent the first transition that students made within 2 years of that fall semester following high school graduation, or they can represent a lack of transition. So for example, the persistent and 2-year bar encapsulates immediate 2-year enrollees who were continuously enrolled for at least 4 semesters at a 2-year college. And if you hover over these bars, a different pop-up box will come up and it will give you information about the degree outcomes associated with the specific pathway that you're looking at. So for example, among immediate 2-year enrollees who persisted in a 2-year college, 13% of students on this pathway completed a 4-year degree and 37% completed a 2-year degree or certificate. Again, we have about 5,000 students at the bottom of that pop-up box, and those are the students that are actually represented by the size of this bar. If you hover over the bars to the right, students' next immediate transition within this 6-year time frame that we're looking at, you'll get the degree outcomes associated with an even more specific pathway. So immediate 2-year enrollees who persisted in a 2-year and then directly transferred to a 4-year college sometime within that 6-year time frame. And so say I was only interested in learning about Latino students who immediately enrolled in a 2-year college. We would use this filter to select whichever race/ethnicity group you're interested in looking at. And again, we might want to start off by getting a sense of the proportion of Latino high school graduates in our sample that are actually represented here. But this time we'll see that the district average is at the bottom in case you want to have a number to compare that percentage with. And then the number of students that are actually represented by that bar are at the top of the pop-up box. And I think that this district average is particularly helpful if you're trying to understand how certain transitions might be differentially associated with degree outcomes for groups of students based on their race/ethnicity or their gender. So here, for example, if you hover over this blue transfer to 4-year bar, you'll get a different pop-up box that will be specifically for Latino students. And the district averages will again be at the bottom of the pop-up box here. And this thin blue bar represents 75 Latino immediate two-year enrollees who transferred to a four-year college sometime within the first 2 years of their post-secondary journey. So you can actually click on the bars in this column to isolate the pathways that students in this first transition group took throughout the rest of the visualization, or you could use our focus filter to actually kind of zoom in and isolate those pathways so that you can see them a little bit more clearly. And here we have degree outcomes for this very specific group of students that you're looking at, Latino immediate two-year enrollees who upward transferred to a four-year college directly within the first 2 years of their post-secondary journey. That would be 55% of Latino students on that very specific pathway completed a degree within the 6 years we were looking at versus the district average, which was 39%. But this bar is only representing 41 students, which we can see at the top of that pop-up box again. So that is the functionality of our fall enrollment status visualizations. But what if you were more interested in the reverse? You wanted to see all students who had completed a four-year degree within the 6 years, but look at where they were the fall semester before. That is the default visualization for our visualizations grouped by degree and certificate outcomes. Again, you can choose a particular degree outcome here or filter by gender or race/ethnicity group here. And just really quick, the leftmost bars will give you a pop-up box with information about the overall number of students in this fall enrollment group, and the number in bold is the number of students actually represented here. So among all 23,000 or so immediate four-year enrollees, about 11,000 or 48% of them completed a four-year degree within 6 years. If you hover over the right, you will get a similar sentence, which is 63,000 students in our sample, but 12,500 or about 20% completed a four-year degree within 6 years. And that is who's represented by this bar. The table below is actually just percentages of what's being represented visually in this diagram. So for example, 87% of four-year degree completers in our sample immediately enrolled in a four-year college, and so on. And again, if you ever want to access our glossary of terms, that is at the bottom of the page. So I hope that this tool proves useful for you all as you continue to dig into the questions that our research presentation may have left you with today. But before you go, I'm going to invite Jenny and Jasmine back up so that they can answer some of the questions that you all have submitted. All right, so the first question we have is, since this analysis was run on 2010 and through 2012 CPS graduates, has there been any indications from more recent data that the trends in this report will continue or change?
Yeah, I think we kind of alluded to actually some of this is that, we've seen college enrollment rates go up more recently compared to like the class that we're looking at here. But I think there's a lot too that I think has been changing both on the CPS side in terms of that, the guidance seems to be improving every single year, but we're also seeing a lot more of a response on the higher ed side. So, a few weeks ago, we released a report looking at college during the pandemic. And one of the things that we noticed there was that there were a few institutions, most notably Western Illinois University and Northern Illinois University, who actually increased their college enrollment rates and their retention rates in the middle of the pandemic. And we had a webinar where we invited them to speak, and they talked about how sort of what they enacted as a response to the pandemic were actually things that had been in the works for a really long time. So they've been doing a lot of, inward looking, thinking about how they can do a better job of supporting first generation college students in both coming to their institutions, but also staying in school. So they implemented a lot of policies and practices where they were really trying to see and understand what students needed in order to both go to their school and to stay in their school. We're also seeing some similar initiatives coming out of city colleges of Chicago, where they are trying to be much more responsive to it. Individual colleges also have different kinds of equity plans that each college has an equity plan where they're really trying to do a better job, particularly of serving Black and Latinx male students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to add to what Jenny just said, like city colleges has had a lot of different policy changes throughout the years. I think around 2010, 2011, they instituted their Reinvention Campaign, which is specifically supposed to help students, help in college guidance and helping students focus on different like majors or focus areas they'd want to do, as well as like getting them through those different paths in order to complete an associate's degree. We also know that in 2015, city colleges enacted their STAR scholarship, providing very generous financial aid for students who have certain high school academic achievements. And this is a scholarship that was also open for all CPS graduates, like regardless of your documentation status too. So I think some of these policies we've seen since these students have graduated will definitely have some downstream effects in the trends we're seeing today.
Yeah, it seems like that's been true in the four-year space as well. I remember NIU and WIU saying that they were starting to tie merit aid to students' GPAs rather than test scores, which opened up access for a lot of CPS graduates. So why do we think the transition from 2 to 4-year colleges is so difficult to navigate for students?
I think there are a lot of different reasons. Like first is the bureaucracy around which credits transfer, right? Like in terms of transfer articulation agreements, it's sometimes hard to know, okay, are the courses I'm taking ones that will actually build up to a 4-year, or like ones that will actually be taken as credit for when I transfer to a 4-year college? I think another thing is also thinking about financial aid and costs and thinking, it's again, as I mentioned with the STAR scholarship, we do see financial aid being provided specifically for undocumented students as well. But 4-year colleges are more expensive in general than 2-year colleges are. That's something to be thinking about, right? As students are deciding whether or not to make that transfer. Additionally, some 2-year college students may be more likely to be working compared to 4-year college students as they're attending college, which means that they need to have more flexible schedules, which it's the question of, is that something that a 4-year college, like do specific 4-year college institutions provide that kind of flexible scheduling for students? Also, we know there's been previous research in the 2-year college space about developmental education courses. So students are sometimes placed into developmental education, which are non-credit bearing courses. And some of the research has shown that sometimes these students are less likely to complete a 2-year college credential, in which case that's something that's preventing them from making that transfer as well.
Yeah, and I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but I think it's sort of like, I feel like the theme of the work of the consortium and the 2 and Through project is just basically like transitions are hard, right? I mean, it's a big consequential decision to change schools. And so, it requires students to kind of address all the challenges that Jasmine talked about, which are both, financial, academic, social. There's a lot of things that are happening over time. And, and 2-year colleges quite often don't have a huge amount of resources, and actually finding guidance to really help students navigate where they're going to college, it's not necessarily all that straightforward. And so actually making a choice and making a good choice is something that becomes really hard for students.
Absolutely. I also think that navigating where you want to go to college and actually getting there is hard, but then all of the transition that students make afterwards, that's not necessarily something that we think about in our traditional college counseling curricula. And so I think that there's maybe a lot that's missing for students in terms of what they expect when they are getting to their post-secondary journey. But so some of the myths, like taking a gap year, have already been disproven by previous research. So why do you two think that these myths persist at the K through 12 level?
I think there's some people who are informed and follow the research and know, but this is probably less research-based, but just kind of impressionistically with talking with people and how we tend to think about college, is that a lot of times how we think about college is sort of based on sort of either our own personal experiences or the people that we know, or the people who are in our social circles. And I think that also extends to what the stories are that we see in media and across the board about what does it mean to go to college. So I think there's something for things like the gap year. I think there's research on it, but a lot of times how people think about something like taking a gap year is because their neighbor took a gap year, or, the child of their friend took a gap year, or their cousin took a gap year. I mean, these are kind of ways that we think about these phenomenon, and they're quite often based on, and we will depend on who you are. But I think a lot of the narratives that are out there kind of more popularly are based on kind of an upper middle class idea of who college students are, and the reality and the financial and all the other barriers that are faced by CPS graduates are quite different, and what it means to be taking a gap year, or to be planning to go from a 2-year college to a 4-year college is quite different, because CPS graduates quite often don't have the same kind of social, financial, and other resources that really facilitate it. And so some of these myths may be true for a segment of the population, but they're actually not true more generally.
Yeah, and with that, I think over time, the milestones that we've been focusing on have changed too. So first we focused on high school graduation. Now we're focusing on college enrollment. What I'm hoping that this report does is allow us to extend the milestones that we're looking at and thinking about, okay, we got kids to college now. What's happening once they get there? How are they experiencing college? How are they navigating a system that's very different from the one that is happening, that they are used to from the K through 12 space. So I think that's a really good question in thinking about what's the disconnect then between K through 12 and higher education. And that's definitely something I hope that we can dig into more as we have more conversations and do some more research on that in that space.
Right. So how do we support students through these seemingly inevitable post-college enrollment transitions? One thing that you said earlier, Jasmine, that I found interesting was about there being a non-causal link between stopping out and not completing. And we got a question about, why do you think that students who return from leave struggle to finish? Jenny and Jasmine.
I mean, it could be that there are factors that influenced why students decided to take a leave in the first place that are also affecting their ability to complete a college, or their ability to complete a college degree. I think another thing to be thinking about though is, if a lot of our guidance structures are focused on an assumption of a direct path, it's like, how does counseling, how does guidance, and how do supports change for students who don't follow that path, who actually are taking a leave? Are there special supports for students who are then coming back? I think those are some of the questions that we could be asking, and then maybe that'll help in answering more of these why questions then, of not only looking at what are students going through, but also how are systems and institutions structured to help these students and respond to them as they navigate that post-secondary structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think, Jasmine, as you said, it's I think the reasons why students stopped out in the first place, I know it's great that a lot of students come back, but quite often the reasons why they left school in the first place haven't gone away. And so as students are continuing to face those challenges going forward, as they continue to exist, that becomes a problem. So I think it is partially I think that, there's probably more research that could be done, but I think also from a practice and policy side at higher ed, when students do re-enroll, I mean, congratulations, I'm glad you're back, or I'm glad you decided to continue your college education, but it's also trying to know what were the reasons why you left in the first place, and helping students develop a plan going forward. Because I think, there's lots of reasons why students leave college. And coming back does not solve those problems usually. And so figuring out ways to continue to support students as they come back, whether it's financial reasons, because they have work responsibilities, family responsibilities, they were struggling academically, they went to a large state university and they were really struggling at being in a kind of what they felt like was an anonymous environment. There's a lot of stories out there as to what happened. And I think the more that people who are on the ground know what caused students to step out in the first place, can help the students who do return be successful in completing a degree.
For sure. So from a high school side, if you two were college counselors, how would you or would you not talk to college student or talk to high school students about college leaves and transfers?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because I mean, like as like this whole report is about how common taking time off and changing schools actually is when students start on their college pathways. So I think, I think we need to acknowledge that that's the reality. But I think it's also something to like stress as students to seniors as they're like planning on going to college. Like you got in, but how do you make sure that you are not just enrolling, that you're actually completing? Is to say that taking time off may make sense at the time, but to the extent you could try to get help so you don't have to leave is better. Transferring, especially from a 4 to a 2-year college, it may seem like the best move, but transitions are really difficult. Like your credits may not transfer. You have to learn a new environment and how to navigate that. You need to need to get to know the people on campus and make new friends and understand a whole new set of systems. And those are always difficult. And so, it's not that it's not like don't at all costs don't take time off or don't transfer, but also know that there are costs to doing that, and there may be reasons why that actually makes it much harder for students to complete.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's painting, just showing like, here's what we know for students who've taken this path before. Like, for example, I'm thinking of the path specifically, like the 2 to 4-year college. It's like, yes, it is possible. It's also very difficult. And I think it's having conversations with students to see, okay, like if this is one you want to take, like, how do we figure this out? How do we make sure that the way you are able to navigate this path is one in which you accomplish your goal of completing some kind of college transition? And what are maybe some other ways that other paths that we can be thinking about in addition to thinking about this path, if that's one that you are really committed to, right? I think it provides students with options and a better idea of what might be at the end of some of these options based on just what other students in the past have experienced or have gone through as well.
Definitely. So we're almost running out of time, but before we go, I want to give you two the chance to just talk about your final calls to reflection for folks. I mean, you two have been working on this for almost 2 years now, and I'm sure you have maybe some final thoughts that you would like to leave us with.
Sure. I mean, I feel like I've actually kind of talked about this a bit in my responses to the questions, but I think one thing that sort of surprised me was like how common it was for students who stopped out to go back to college. Because I guess on a couple of levels, I mean, I didn't think the reason why students stop out is because they decided that college wasn't for them. But I was both, I was kind of, I don't know, just sort of encouraged by the resilience of students who take time off, that they do truly want to complete, a college degree or certificate. And even though something happened that interrupted their college pathway, they decided to go back and carry on. And so I think that really makes me think that, like, one, if these students really do want to complete, what can we do to support them so they don't end up taking time off? Mm-hmm. And then if life circumstances or whatever else does mean that they do have to take time off, because we know that that's the reality that students live in, how do we facilitate their return? How do we make sure that the reasons why they needed to take time off from school are not continued barriers for them to get to completion? Because as we saw that a lot of students who take time off, they become so much less likely to complete. But I also wonder, because when students are coming back to college or taking some time off after having started at a different college, they're still on their own and they're still facing the same challenges, and and they haven't figured out how to address them, and probably more importantly, the colleges that they're attending have not found ways to make sure that those students are supporting. So I think it's sort of a group that maybe colleges are not thinking of as intentionally, that the students who are coming in after having had taken some time off as being an important group to make sure that they're sort of getting the same sorts of supports and probably even more supports than the students who are entering college for the first time.
Yeah, I think through this process of doing this research, something like I just want to remind people, this is a descriptive study. We're able to look at the what, the when, the where, but we aren't able to look into the why. And I think the why is going to be very different depending on students' backgrounds, where students are coming from, depending on the institutions they're going to. It's going to be deeply contextual. And what I'm hoping is that this report can be something that can help frame those conversations once folks can start to interrogate this question of why within their own context. And I think that is ultimately how we're able to create changes then that can better support students to help them complete a college credential if that's something that they desire to do.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you say that, Jasmine, because tomorrow we'll have the opportunity to actually talk to a few students. One thing I'm really excited about hearing from them is what are they doing when they're not enrolled in college? I think, we have these grayed out lines and boxes, but they're still experiencing things, they're still learning. And so I think wondering what that looks like is going to be really helpful for me. And also just understanding how they experience these transitions will be really helpful. So please RSVP to that. Dom just dropped the link to the Eventbrite in the chat. And again, please download a report, explore this tool, play around with it. Let us know if you have any questions. And also don't forget that we have research briefs that summarize the key findings from our report available for download on the report's webpage. We have some for practitioners, some for students and families, and we will also be translating those to Spanish really soon. So check back soon for Spanish translated versions of those. And thank you so much again, Jasmine and Jenny, for your time, for your call to reflection. And we hope to see you all soon at another 2 and 3 event. Thank you all.